The hard problem of consciousness is considered by many to be one of the deepest problems in all of philosophy. But one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, gives us reason to think that the problem itself might be confused. Not unsolved, confused. Now, Wittgenstein obviously never used the phrase the hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers introduced that terminology in 1995, more than 40 years after Wittgenstein died. But Wittgenstein did talk about, quote, the feeling of an unbridgeable gulf between consciousness and brain process, end quote. And that already sounds like the modern problem in its rawest form. So the question is, where does that feeling come from? And is it revealing a deep metaphysical fact or a philosophical misunderstanding? Wittgenstein begins with a simple observation. In ordinary scientific contexts, there's nothing mysterious about the relation between brain and experience. He notes that this is perfectly ordinary to discover in the course of an experiment. Quote, an effect of light which I see is produced by stimulation of a particular part of the brain, end quote. So the science itself is not where the problem arises. The unbridgeable gap appears somewhere else. He says, quote, it is when I, for example, turn my attention in a particular way onto my own consciousness, and astonished say to myself, this is supposed to be produced by a process in the brain, as it were clutching my forehead. But what can it mean to speak of turning my attention onto my own consciousness? There is surely nothing more extraordinary than that there should be any such thing, end quote. Wittgenstein's diagnosis is not that this feeling is the discovery of a new problem. It is the result of a certain way of looking at consciousness. He even describes it as a kind of philosophical illusion, a logical trick. This fits Wittgenstein's broader diagnosis of philosophical confusion. In Philosophical Investigation, section 115, he famously says, quote, a picture held us captive, end quote. The picture relevant here is something like this. There is the body, there's the brain, and then behind all of that, there's something else, private inner world of consciousness. Once we adopt this picture, consciousness begins to look like a hidden object. And immediately, a whole family of philosophical problems come in. How do I know anyone else has consciousness? Could your consciousness be completely different from mine? Could all the outward signs exist without consciousness? Could a philosophical zombie behave exactly like us? And above all, how could a physical brain possibly produce this private inner thing? But Wittgenstein's first question is not how to solve these problems. It is, did we generate them by adopting the picture in the first place? Wittgenstein's method is to return philosophical words to their circumstances in which they ordinarily have a use. He writes, quote, now, sentences like I see, I hear, I am conscious really have their uses. I tell a doctor, now I can hear with this ear again. Or I tell someone who believes I'm faint, I am conscious again, and so on. End quote. These uses are completely intelligible. We know how these expressions work. And notice what we do not do. We do not first identify some hidden inner object called consciousness and then attach the word to it. The concept already has a place within human life. Then Wittgenstein asks what happens when philosophers detach consciousness from these ordinary circumstances. In section 416, he considers the idea that human beings act as their own witnesses that they possess consciousness. His response? Quote, whom do I really inform if I say that I have consciousness? What is the purpose of saying this to myself, and how can another person understand me? End quote. I don't normally inspect myself and discover, there it is, consciousness. That philosophical use of the word is already quite different from its ordinary use. To show what he means, Wittgenstein introduces the beetle example. In section 293, he writes, quote, well, everyone tells me that he knows what pain is only from his own case. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it which we call a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle, end quote. Now imagine we all use the word beetle in everyday life. We talk about it, teach it, use it correctly. But Wittgenstein draws a striking conclusion, quote, the thing in the box doesn't belong to the language game at all, end quote. How could this be? In other words, the thing in the box doesn't determine the meaning of the word beetle in any way. Why? Quote, here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But what if people's word beetle had a use nonetheless? If so, it would not be as a name of a thing, for the box might even be empty, end quote. Whatever is inside the box cannot determine how the word is used. The private object does not and cannot fix meaning. It drops out entirely. And this is the key move. If something plays no role in public use of a word, it cannot be what gives the word its meaning. The Beetle argument shows that private language doesn't determine the meaning of the word. But in section 258, Wittgenstein's private language argument goes further. It asks whether a purely private object could establish a meaningful standard, even for myself. Imagine I have a completely private sensation. I decide to call it S. Whenever that sensation occurs, I write S in my diary. I might think I have privately defined this word by concentrating on the sensation and fixing the connection in memory. But Wittgenstein asks, how will I know that I'm using S correctly? His answer is devastating. Quote, in the present case, I have no criterion of correctness. Whatever is going to seem correct to me is correct, and that only means that here we can't talk about correct. End quote. Problem is not that sensation is unreal. The problem is that a purely private standard cannot establish a distinction between this seems correct to me and this is correct. And if that distinction disappears, then the notion of using the sign correctly disappears with it. So Wittgenstein is not denying private experience. He is denying that a purely private object can, all by itself, ground the meaning of a concept. This leads me to one of Wittgenstein's most important remarks in section 580. Quote, an inner process stands in need of outward criteria, end quote. This does not mean that an inner process is identical with outward criteria. It means that psychological concepts have public criteria of application within human life. Take pain. In section 244, Wittgenstein asks how words refer to sensations. He gives this example, quote, a child has hurt himself and he cries. Then adults talk to him and teach him exclamations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior, end quote. The child does not begin by privately inspecting an inner object, identifying its metaphysical essence, and then attaching the word pain to it. Pain language grows out of natural human expression. The concept is embedded in public circumstances, reactions, learning, correction, and expression. And the same basic point applies to seeing, hearing, thinking, and consciousness. At this point, an obvious objection appears. If pain has outward criteria, what about someone who fakes pain? Or someone who is in terrible pain but successfully hides it? Doesn't that prove that the real pain must be something completely independent of all outward expression? Wittgenstein anticipates this. In section 250, he asks, quote, why can't a dog simulate pain? End quote. You could train a dog to howl when nothing hurts. But Wittgenstein says that alone would not yet amount to genuine simulation because, quote, the surroundings which are necessary for this behavior to be real simulation are missing, end quote. Pretending itself belongs to a larger human practice. To fake pain, there must already be circumstances in which we distinguish genuine pain, exaggerated pain, concealed pain, mistaken reports, deliberate deception. So the possibility of faking pain does not prove that pain is a completely independent private object. In fact, faking pain presupposes the ordinary practices of expressing and recognizing pain. So is Wittgenstein just a behaviorist? No. And Wittgenstein explicitly anticipates this accusation. In section 304, his interlocutor insists that surely there's a difference between, quote, pain behavior with pain and pain behavior without pain, end quote. Wittgenstein does not deny that difference. Of course there's a difference. He is not saying pain is nothing but behavior. However, he is saying that we make a philosophical mistake when we move from pain is not identical to behavior to therefore pain must be an independently identifiable private object hidden behind behavior. That second step does not follow. The mistake is not believing that we have an inner life. The mistake is picturing that inner life as a private realm whose contents can be identified completely independently of the criteria through which our psychological concepts operate. Color makes the temptation especially vivid. Suppose I point at something and say, that is red. We teach children the word red. We sort red objects, we distinguish red from green, we correct mistakes. There are established public criteria for using the concept. Now someone asks, but how do I know your experience of red is the same as mine? The question feels profound, but notice what has happened. We have introduced another thing, the private redness itself. And then we stipulate that this private redness could vary completely while making no difference to behavior, discrimination, memory, learning, correction, language, or anything else. At that point, the beetle in the box argument returns. If the private object can vary while an entire language game remains unchanged, then the private object cannot be what gives the word red its meaning. That does not mean there is no experience of red. It means the private qualitative accompaniment is not functioning as the criterion that determines the concept. And that is exactly the philosophical move Wittgenstein wants us to notice. Now consider philosophical zombies. In section 420, Wittgenstein asks us to imagine the people around us as automata. They behave exactly as usual, but we tell ourselves, perhaps there is no consciousness inside. Wittgenstein says that if we genuinely try to maintain this thought in ordinary life, something peculiar happens. We find that the words begin to lose their ordinary meaning, or we generate a strange feeling of uncanniness. That's revealing, because the zombie intuition is supposed to reveal a deep metaphysical possibility. All the outward facts could remain while consciousness disappears. But Wittgenstein asks us to examine what we are actually doing when we imagine this. Have we discovered an independently identifiable missing phenomenon? Or have we taken the ordinary concept of consciousness, removed every circumstance in which we apply it, and then tried to imagine its absence as though we were subtracting an invisible ingredient? Now we finally return to the hard problem. The hard problem asks us to imagine that science has explained everything functional: perception, discrimination, attention, memory, learning, report, behavior, reasoning, action. And then it says, but something still remains unexplained: consciousness itself. This is precisely where Wittgenstein's method becomes relevant. What exactly is the thing that remains? Suppose we remove every criterion through which we ordinarily identify consciousness. Once every criterion for the application of consciousness has been stipulated away, what entitles us to say that we've isolated consciousness in its purest form, rather than simply detach the word from the conditions that gave it any sense? Maybe we have taken a word that has perfectly intelligible uses in ordinary life and transformed it into the name of an intrinsically private object. And then, having defined that object as completely independent of everything physical, functional, and publicly criterial, we ask, how could anything physical possibly produce it? At that point, the unbridgeable gulf is guaranteed. But perhaps it is guaranteed because of the way we constructed the problem. We created two completely independent realms: the physical process on one side, the private phenomenal object on the other, and then became astonished that we couldn't explain the connection between them. That may be the logical trick Wittgenstein saw. So, did Wittgenstein solve the hard problem of consciousness? Not in the scientific sense. He did something much more radical. He questioned whether the problem, as ordinarily formulated, is well formed. In Zettel, he pushes the issue even further when he examines the statement, quote, "I have consciousness," end quote. The typical philosopher hears this as the statement of the most certain fact imaginable. I can say, quote, "there is consciousness inside me," end quote. But Wittgenstein asks, what exactly have you said? Whom are you informing? What would count against it? What makes this sentence function as a proposition at all? And this is why Wittgenstein matters to the hard problem. Because maybe consciousness is not a mysterious object waiting for science to explain. Maybe the mystery appears when we mistake the grammar of psychological language for the structure of reality. The hard problem asks, how does a physical brain produce consciousness? Wittgenstein asks a prior question. What made us think consciousness was the kind of independently identifiable thing that had to be produced by the brain in the first place? And if Wittgenstein is right, then the hardest problem in philosophy of mind may not be a problem waiting for a solution. It may be a picture waiting to be escaped.